I'll start by telling a short story. According to an article written by Technical Sergeant Annie Proctor, Staff Sergeant Fegan was the first pilot to fly into Fort Myers, Florida in a B-26. When he landed, he walked into base ops and handed his clearance paperwork to a major working at the ops desk. The major looked at him and asked, "Where's your pilot or your commanding officer?" And he replied, "I don't have one. I am the pilot. But my radio man is a technical sergeant if you'd like to speak to him." So the major, being disappointed, walked away, returned with the colonel. The colonel tapped Sergeant Fegan on the shoulder and said, "Well, Sergeant, it's clear that you flew this plane here on your own, and there's nothing I can do to keep you from flying out of here." So that's exactly what Staff Sergeant Fegan did. So this story, along with many others, shows an accurate depiction of what it was like for these enlisted pilots during that era. In the rest of my brief, I will explain to you some of their challenges and some of their accomplishments. So where did it all begin? First, Private First Class Vernon Burge, some of you may know as the first Air Force pilot. He started out as a mechanic working for Lieutenant Benjamin Fouas. Their job was to maintain the Army's first and only aircraft at the time. After 2 years of working with the lieutenant, Burge was sent to the Philippines, where he worked for Lieutenant Lamb. Lieutenant Lamb's responsibility at the time was to set up a brand new flight school, but he had a hard time getting students to apply. At the time, there was only one officer. So Private Burge went to Lieutenant Lamb and said, "Hey, instruct me on how to fly, and I'll be just as good as the officer pilots." So that's what Lieutenant Lamb did. He instructed him. After 2 years, Burge earned his certification as a flyer, and that was in 1912. However, he wasn't received well within the flying community. A lot of the officers ostracized him as being an enlisted pilot. Lieutenant Lamb, being a good supervisor, he addressed this concern all the way up to Congress in Washington. And Washington came back and basically told him that he had violated policy by training an enlisted guy to fly. So needless to say, Burge went back to being a full-time maintainer. Although he did fly from time to time, he eventually earned a commission all the way up to the rank of lieutenant colonel, where he retired in 1941. So as you can see, Burge paved the way for many enlisted flyers, but it was going to take a change in policy for many others to earn their wings. In July 1914, the Army changed its mind about enlisted pilots. Congress established the aviation section of the Signal Corps, which allowed enlisted pilots to actually recognize enlisted as official pilots. And also, and I quote from Air Force Magazine, the new policy stated that 12 enlisted men at a time shall, with the discretion of their office and command, shall be instructed in the art of flying. So only 12 at a time. Eventually those numbers changed, but as these guys went through training, they gained commission, but there were others that remained as enlisted. Despite them being legitimate pilots, they still had a hard time getting flying hours. It wasn't until the U.S. entered World War I where these pilots were able to fly with the British. Now, that complicated the situation because the American officers had a hard time accepting him as enlisted. But the British, and I quoted that only an officer and a gentleman should be allowed to fly. So what that said was that these enlisted pilots were not viewed as on the same playing field as the officer counterparts, and they did not view these guys as gentlemen at all, as men. So those are some of the challenges that they experienced. Also, in terms of their opportunities, they were only allowed to fly as test pilots, couriers, and instructors. So nothing that had to do with combat at all. After the war, the numbers dropped from 200,000 to about 10,000, which required many of them to separate from the military. Those that stayed, that had also gained a commission, had to revert back to being an enlisted guy. So over the next 20 years, aviation started to boom, and then there was a greater demand for pilots. So new flying programs were created so that they would train these enlisted guys. Their training, or while they were in training, they were treated as inferior to their officer counterparts, the cadets, often not being able to eat in the same mess halls with them, not being able to bunk with them, and on graduation day, they were not allowed to exit through the same door as those cadets were. Also, the mission of their training was to instruct them as backup pilots so that they fill those not so glamorous positions. Okay. However, it wasn't for long that these guys that were intended to pull a backup role, that they were actually flying those combat missions. They were in charge. To their accomplishments, between 1912 and 1942, over 3,700 enlisted pilots had earned their wings. 17 were flight aces, 11 were promoted to general officers, 155 were killed in combat, and many others became commercial pilots. After World War II, demobilization cut the air inventory, which slashed manning. Also, in 1948, the Air Force was created, and the Air Force mandated that as of the end of that year, that all enlisted flyers had to be grounded, that they were no longer able to fly. It's been speculated that this was because the Air Force at the time was trying to improve its image. They wanted to portray an image of education, of sophistication, of professionalism, and it didn't think that the enlisted force possessed that at the time. Also, the Air Force did not want to recognize enlisted pilots as part of its history. And the rare times that it was mentioned about enlisted pilots, they often cited them as flying gliders and liaison planes, but not real airplanes. Had it not been for the persistence of World War II veterans